Brendan Sandrson.
Hi. This reminds me of being in my lecture hall back at BYU. So I like that everyone has comfy seats and things like that. I will try not to be too professorial on you. Though they were very, very specific with my topic this time. They said, talk about fantasy. Fortunately, it's something I know a little bit about, so I can talk. So the way we're going to arrange this is, I'm going to blab at you for a little while about my kind of thoughts on fantasy. It's mostly going to focus on my journey into becoming a writer and things like this. And I'll talk a little bit about how I ended up getting published and that sort of story. And then we will probably go from there. Maybe do a little bit of Q&A about the fantasy genre. At that point, if Dee Dee's on board with that, we might do that. And then I probably will wrap up with a reading. Yeah. I brought my laptop. I have Stormlight 4 here. Yeah, we'll be... So I'll read some of that. I will read a non-spoilery part. I'll read one of the flashbacks or the prologue, which those all take place before the first book starts, and so it won't spoil the series for those who haven't read it. Yeah, my story, fantasy. Let's talk about the fantasy genre. I was sitting at a signing. This was a couple years ago. And I was signing books, and I signed a book for a very excited young woman who got the book signed. It was all great. And as she wandered off, her mother had been there with her. And she looked at me, and she leaned down. She said, I don't want to be offensive, but I can't get her to read anything other than this fantasy stuff. And I just want to know, why? Why do people read fantasy? And I had an answer for her, because this is a question I get asked a lot. Not by you guys who are here, but if I do an interview like with public radio or something like that, they always are like, why do you people read this stuff? They say it nicer than that, but they're like, you're all so weird. What is it in this that you like so much? And I've given a lot of thought to this. The why fantasy, because my story, some of you heard this a little earlier. I'm sorry if it's a repeat, but my story is that I was not a reader when I was young. I was given a lot of books this is when I was in 6th and 7th grade. I don't know if that is an analog over here, but you know, I was like 11, 12, 13, and people kept giving me books and said, oh, you'll love this one. And they were always books about boys my age, and I found them boring. I did not want to read about boys my age, particularly boys who had pet dogs, because the dog always dies. I'll tell you that. They were just, you know, and lots of people love these books. There's nothing wrong with these books, but I would get like 3 or 4 chapters in, and I'd be like, I am so bored of this kid living in a place like me, doing all the stuff that I do. I know what school is like. School sucks. Don't give me a book about a kid in school, right? And I just didn't read. It was 8th grade when I had a teacher, and her name was Ms. Reader. This is true. And she was my English teacher. She was teaching, you know, literature, and she assigned things called book reports, right? I don't know if you guys had to do these. Yeah, it's like you read a book and you write a whole thing about it. Well, if you're a kid who's too smart for their own good, but also doesn't want to work, you learn very quickly that you can read the back of the book, and you can summarize what the book is about really easily by doing that and reading the last chapter. And I started doing this with my book reports, and my teacher knew. She called me in after school one day, and she said, Brandon, you're not reading these books. I want you to do a book report on a book you actually are going to read. And so I said, all right, I'll do a book report on one of my favorite books. It is one I liked when I was in 2nd grade. And I tried to talk her into letting me read that one. She's like, no, you are now in 8th grade. You have to read real books. And I'm like, I don't like real books. They're boring. They're, you know, kids, dogs, dead, dog. That's the book. She's like, I think I have some books that you'll like. And she took me to the back of her room. And they have, I don't know, teachers over here, back then they had like carts of books that like 100 kids have read, and they have like, they're stained with school lunch leftovers and things like that, right? And she took me back there and she said, these are books that I love. I want you to read one of these, and your book report will be talking to me about it so I can make sure you read it. And I can still remember browsing through that thing, and I landed on a book called Dragon's Bane by Barbara Hamley. And it has this really awesome picture of a dragon on the front, and really in this cool pose. And it was bigger than most books I read, but I thought, I'll give it a try, right? I'll read this book. And I loved this book. This book meant everything to me. And when people say, why fantasy? I look back and I'm like, why did I like that book so much? Why did I latch onto this book? Because this book should not have worked. If anyone read Dragon's Bane? It's a little lesser known novel. There's a couple of you. It's a fantastic book, but the main premise is it's about a middle-aged woman, not a kid in school, a middle-aged woman in a fantasy world, and her husband, her partner, is the only living man who's ever slain a dragon. He did it when he was young and in his 20s or whatever. And they are now off living in the boonies as farmers, as pig farmers, and a new dragon has come to threaten the kingdom. And someone comes up from the court and says, we need you to come slay this dragon. And the guy's like, I'm retired. You don't understand. I'm like in my, I don't know, in my head he's like 60 or 70 or 100. He's probably like 40, my age now. But when I was a kid, it was like, I'm like, he's so old, right? He is an old dude. And, you know, they had kids and they had a family. And it's this guy who's like, I don't know if I want to do this. And it's told from her viewpoint where she's like, you can't go do this. You can't slay a dragon as an old man or middle-aged man. You will just get ripped to pieces. We have to be smart about this and come up with a way to defeat this dragon that does not involve you riding with a sword and a lance toward the dragon. And he's like, yeah, let's come up with something. And so it's kind of them collaborating on this whole thing. And it's about the viewpoint protagonist, like I said, should not have, you don't give this traditionally to a 13-year-old boy, a book about a woman in her 40s who her story is she's been told by her mentor that she could probably be the greatest magic user that he's ever known if she would just dedicate herself to her magic. But she also has a family, and she is dividing her time between her family and her magic and trying to decide where to put her priorities. And it's basically a woman trying to balance her family life and her career, right? This is the fantasy novel that made me into a fantasy reader. And I look back and I'm like, why did that work? Why did this story click with me when so many other stories hadn't? And I don't know, have you heard this story, Goober? Have I told this one? This is my mom right here. She's here, yes, everyone clap for my mother. I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but I got done with this book and I was loving it. And one of the reasons I really loved it is, so my mother is a fantastic person. My mother graduated first in her class in accounting in a year where she was one of the only women in the entire accounting program. And I knew that she had given up a prestigious scholarship to go on to get a master's degree in accounting, a CPA, because she wanted to have me and raise me when I was young. And then she went back to accounting after once I was in school. And as a kid, as a teenager in particular, when I heard these, I'm like, well, of course she did. I'm me, right? Of course you would delay your career for your son, if your son is me. But I'm reading this book and I'm like, stupid woman, ditch those kids. Go be a wizard, right? And I get done with this book and it doesn't have answers, right? It's about someone struggling with this balance because there aren't answers. There's maybe some individual answers, but everybody comes to their own answers. And I enjoyed this story, and I fell in love with this story, and I got done with this great story about slaying a dragon and magic, and I felt like I understood my mother better. And that is part of what grabbed me. I knew what it was like to be me. I didn't know what it was like to be my mother. I didn't know what it was like to live in this different world. I didn't know what it was like to do all of these different things. And why fantasy, why literature is kind of the same question. If we're only reading about ourselves, then really, what's the point? The point of stories for me is to take me someplace I've never been, make me see the world in a new way. And a lot of times when the great stories we're reading, these great high fantasy stories, are informing our understanding of our world. Because fantasy is not about another world, it's about our world through the lens of another world. And a lot of times, like, you could not have taken me as a 13-year-old boy and given me a story about an accountant choosing between her career and her family and had me read it. Nope. But you give me that story with dragons, and suddenly I'm so on board that, you know, you can't get me off. And I love this idea. I absolutely fell in love with the wonder of fantasy and also with the realism of fantasy, with connecting me. And so when people ask me why fantasy, my answer is usually along these lines. I say, look, a fantasy novel can do anything you can do in any other novel. You will find literary fantasy that has all the literary styling and beautiful prose that you will find in any literary novel. N.K. Jemisin is doing it right now, right? And you can go read like Ursula Le Guin and some of the greats who have great literary styling, and it's fantasy. If instead you like mysteries, you can go read fantasy that has the best mystery writing you can find. You can find fantastic detective stories told like Harry Dresden stories with fantasy. If you like romance, you can find romantic fiction that is in the fantasy category that has the most powerful and passionate romance, and you can do all of these things plus have dragons. So why would you read anything else? That's really my answer, is why not? Why would you read anything normal when you can read fantasy and you can get everything normal plus you can have all these cool things? I mean, fantasy in some ways is defined by its setting. Stories are made up of basically 3 general categories. Stories have plot, setting, and character, and then conflict is kind of the glue that glues those 3 things together. Conflict between setting and character, or between character and character, or between the plot, what you know the story wants the character to do and why they can't do it. This is where stories come from: plot, setting, and character. It's interesting though. When I teach my course at the university and I talk about fantasy and science fiction, one of the things I point out is, in a lot of ways, if you look at those 3 circles, the setting is the least important. We're all here at a science fiction fantasy convention because of the setting, right? That's what unites us. We love fantastical settings. But a book with great characters and a weak setting is usually still a pretty good book. Let's be honest. A book with an excellent plot but a weak setting, usually still a pretty good book. But a book with a great setting and terrible characters, or a terrible plot, usually is actually a pretty bad book. It can make a great short story, but as novel-length things go, if you don't have character and plot, you don't have a good book. So it's this weird sort of conundrum, right? Where we are here because we love great settings, but setting is the least important. A setting is only as valuable as its influence on the characters. And this is one of the things I talk about. I am known for my settings, my magic systems. This is a thing that made me famous. And don't get me wrong, I'd rather be famous than not. So it's good to be known for something, right? I made my place in the genre by writing very rule-based, scientific styled magic systems. They aren't actual science, they are scientifically inclined magic systems, so to speak. And that's where my niche was. And I kind of found myself to that direction accidentally, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's this weird thing where doesn't matter how great your magic system is, if it's not happening to characters we care about, then the book's not going to be great. And so at the end of the day, we love settings because of what they highlight in the human experience. So the why fantasy, if I'm answering why fantasy, again, I'm saying, well, to take it from a different direction, we love fantasy because extreme conditions can highlight the human experience in extreme ways that a normal story just can't do. If we look at something like Lord of the Rings and we see the journey of Frodo and Sam and their friendship and what it goes through and the test upon their characters and personalities as they persevere toward this ultimate ending where the entire fate of the world is on the shoulders of two very literally small people, that's a metaphor and that's a story that you couldn't tell in our world. There's no way you could conceive a realistic story that puts the fate of the world to that extent upon these two individuals. But in fantasy, we can. And what does that do? It allows us to show forth kind of the extremes of human experience in ways that stories just can't otherwise do. So the setting's point is not just to be there. We don't read fantasy just because of the place that it takes us. It's because of the place that it takes us and what it shows us about ourselves while we're there. And so I usually, when I get asked this on NPR or something like that, on radio programs for normal people, shall we say, that's becoming less and less a distinction as fantasy and science fiction culture becomes pop culture and everybody knows about it. But you still do get these questions. I try to point out that with extreme settings, you can tell extreme stories, and you can push the human experience in lots of different ways. This is what made me want to be a writer. I read Dragonsbane, and I read all the books in the card catalog next to it. I read Dragonflight. I read Dragon Prince by Emily Ron. By the way, if you like romance, Dragon Prince, thumbs up. That's book's not read as much as it deserves to be read nowadays. But the idea being that I fell in love with this idea of being a writer. See, I wanted to know what these authors did, right? I am not, people who know me, my mother can attest to this, my wife who's here somewhere, I don't think she's at this session, can attest to this. I'm not a really emotional person. In fact, I'm kind of the opposite, right? If you have, I have a brother-in-law who's bipolar, and he experiences wide ranges in emotions that fluctuate frequently. On any given day, you're not sure which emotional range he's in. Me, I'm like right at the same point almost every day. Moving that needle of emotional experience for me is really hard. But something that can do it is a well-told story, particularly that shows off the kind of extremes of human experience. If you want to see me tear up, right, you show me the end of the second Lord of the Rings film, where they have been fighting at Helm's Deep forever, right? Best moment in cinema, and they're at their wits' end, and they're all about to die, and they've ridden out for their final fight, and then they remember what Gandalf told them, that if they survive to the morning of the third day, right, beautiful foreshadowing, you just need to survive, and then they look up and Gandalf comes up over the rise, right? You will see me cry. The only time you'll see me cry is on moments like that, where everything comes together narratively, where you have a character arc and a plot arc and something well foreshadowed that we've forgotten about coming together all at the same moment to a climactic, beautiful, sublime moment, and that gets me, right? That really gets me. And I read these sorts of moments in these books You know, Anne McCaffrey was really good at these moments, and I would think, I am really feeling something powerful. I want to learn how they do this. See, I'll let you in on a little secret. I'm a Slytherin, okay? Right? Okay, Slytherin pride, right? So I'm a good Slytherin. We can be good. Ambition can be good, right? Yes. And so as a Slytherin, I read that. Now, a Hufflepuff would read it and be like, wow, this is great. And a Gryffindor might be like, good for you, well done. And a Ravenclaw might be like, let's analyze this. And the Slytherin's like, I can use that, right? I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna learn to do it because I wanna do that to people too. And I read these books and I'm like, I need to know the secret to their power. And I became the ultimate fantasy reader that summer. I read everything I could get my hands on. I was going to the library and coming back with stacks. I was going to the bookstore and coming back with stacks. My whole life changed. And my mother really liked it because I went from a B, C student to a straight A student. 9th grade, I got straight A's. 8th grade, I got B's and C's. And the difference was that I found something I wanted to do. And that kind of Slytherin inside of me said, I need to be good at this. I have to do well in school now. There's a reason, because if I don't do well, I won't be able to go to college and learn how to write stories like this. And I instantly had motivation and became a straight A student, just like that, because I found something I cared about. And I started writing my very first book the next year. I wrote it, we had what was called an electronic typewriter. This was a step between typewriters and PCs for you young kids who didn't experience this terrible, terrible stage. What it was you typed one sentence on a little LCD screen that you could then go back and edit, and then you hit enter, and it typed it out with actual key, like typewriter keys. It was an actual typewriter that you could turn to manual if you wanted, and then it saved that sentence to a disk, and then you wrote the next sentence. And you wrote one sentence at a time, and then you could later on be like, type this out again for me. And it would just use, it's like a player piano, except for a typewriter, that it's just typing things out for you. It was really cool, but it was also terrible because it was not a great way to edit. But I wrote my very first attempt at a novel on this. I was so embarrassed to be writing, though. This is a teenage mindset, that I would take these, print them off, and I hid them behind the picture in my room. The painting, right? This is not what normal teenage boys are hiding from their parents, but it is what I hid were my novels that I was trying to write. Because I was so embarrassed that I wasn't, you get shy about these things, right? It's kind of weird for me to think about now, looking back, because right now, my books have probably been read by like 10 million people. So, that's it's a very different world from a kid who didn't even want his family to know he was writing. But I was very self-conscious at that time. But fortunately, I heard some advice, and I don't remember when I heard it, but it told me that your first 5 books are generally terrible. And that was great for me to hear. For some people, that's really discouraging. For me, it was like, oh, good. I don't have to be good yet. I can just write. And I spent the next, I was 16. I spent the next 13 years writing. Did a lot of it working at a graveyard shift at a hotel. But it was my quest, right? My quest was to figure out how people did this. Now, my mother, being the very, very smart woman that she is, told me, writing is kind of an uneven career. You might want to have a good backup plan, or you might want to study something that you're excited about that then lets you actually do your writing on the side. She didn't know it, but it's actually excellent advice for all writers. Stephen King put similar advice in his book. He says, if you want to be a writer, instead of studying writing, study something you're passionate about, and then write stories about that. Almost all the time, you're going to do better practicing your writing on your own and finding your passion and then letting that inform your writing to make it distinctive, right? This is kind of the Michael Crichton philosophy. Study medicine and then make books that use it, or things like this. There is one caveat to that. That is, if you go to university to study writing, you can turn in your writing as homework, and it makes your university career a little easier. There's a lot less of a workload. I took that route. I did go my freshman year to university as a biochemistry major. My mother had always wanted a doctor. She tried very hard on all 4 of her children. None of us went that route. I was the closest because I really like science, if you can tell from my books. I really like it. But what I found is I hate the busy work. When you go to university and you say, I want to be a chemist or maybe a doctor, they say, oh good, here are the really hard classes your first year to make sure you're not making a big mistake. And they put me in those classes, and I learned really quickly that I had made a big mistake. Spending hours on end finding out how many moles of this are in how many Avogadro's numbers there are to screw in a light bulb, I don't know. Doing all those calculations and the big long formulas and things was not my jam. Let's just say that. Instead, I decided, wow, I don't want to do this, but I love the writing. Back then, I was writing on an 8086. For you computer fans out there, this was the monochrome monitors running, WordPerfect for DOS. That wasn't because I'm that old. It's just because that's all I could afford. All my friends had real computers. But I spent a lot of time writing, and I really, during that year, solidified, this is really what I want to do. And the real sign of it was that I love the busy work. When I sat down to work on a story, 10 hours could pass and I wouldn't notice. When I sat down to solve a formula, it was the opposite. I feel like 10 hours had passed and it had been 10 seconds. With the writing, I was there, I was in it. It was so compelling for me to tell these stories. I am Mormon, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so I served a 2-year mission in Korea, and I will tell you, I was so happy to be on another continent from chemistry for those 2 years. It was bliss to not have to be doing any more chemistry. I came back and changed my major to creative writing. Really, they didn't have a creative writing major. It was English with a creative writing emphasis. And I threw myself into writing the stories, and I spent all those years until I was about 29 just writing books and hoping someday someone would publish them. This brings me to kind of every hero's journey has a low point. You're hearing my journey and my origin story. There's a point we call the belly of the whale, if you've read Joseph Campbell. This is the point where, in practical terms, your father calls you and says, Brandon, your mother's really worried. Which is my father's code for, she hasn't said anything, but I'm really worried, but I don't want to say that. Am I right on that? Yeah. You've been going for doing this writing thing for about 10 years now. How many books have you written? Well, Dad, I've written 13. How many of them have you made any money off of? 0. It's like, your mother's very concerned about that. It's actually exactly what he said. This is my father. Your mother thinks that maybe you ought to find some way to actually make a profession out of your life. Maybe you should go become a professor or something. He didn't realize, though, that I really couldn't go just become a professor. For anyone who's in academia, if you want to teach a certain discipline, there is an amount of rigor and research and things you have to do that I just didn't have time to do because of the writing. I was in quite a position. So what had happened, and this will get into the other topic they wanted me to talk about, which is where does the fantasy genre going? What is fantasy like in 2019? Well, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, fantasy was in an interesting place. What had happened is, and this is kind of my armchair philosophy on the history of the fantasy genre, fantasy, I view having 3 traditions, 3 classic traditions of fantasy. The first is, and the oldest, is what we call the portal fantasy. This is person from our world drops through a portal or goes on a journey to a mystical place, experiences very odd things, and then eventually returns. You can say the Odyssey is a portal fantasy, but the first true portal fantasy is Alice in Wonderland, right? Of course, you may recognize Narnia, Harry Potter. A lot of these tend to be young adult, but not all of them. Guardians of the Flame during the 80s is one of these portal fantasies. The Fiona of Our Tapestry, there are adult ones too, but the idea is drop through a portal, a person from our world experiences something fantastical. Then there was the second line, which has lots of classical roots, which is low magic, usually buff dude, goes and kills monsters and wizards. Right? This is the adventure fantasy. This is the kind of male power fantasy. This is your Edgar Rice Burroughs and your Robert E. Howard and things like this. And this really modified and became very self-aware later on, because I think like Elric is kind of this, but it's a very self-aware version of it. And this is where, you know, fantasy, there were these two lines of fantasy that people were reading, and then this guy sauntered along called J.R.R. Tolkien, and he said, "Poppycock, there's a third type of fantasy." And he wrote The Lord of the Rings. First The Hobbit, obviously. And there was nothing like this. I don't think we, of even my generation, who was a generation after this, can appreciate how different it was. See, Conan was on our world. It was past of our world, but it was on our world. All the portal fantasies were about person from our world goes to a fantastical world. Almost all of these fantasies were about our world extrapolated, and Tolkien said, no, completely different mythology, completely different place. No one from our world is on it. It's not Earth, it's Middle Earth. It's a different planet. And he wrote this brilliant epic fantasy that nobody knew what to do with. It was really revolutionary, and then he died. Right? And everyone's like, wait, Professor Tolkien, come back and give us more, right? And for a long time, my generation that I say of fantasy readers, this is late 70s through the 80s, early 90s, the fantasy genre was very Tolkien inspired, right? This is where your Terry Brooks, sort of genre, fantastic book series, very Tolkien-esque, right? This is where your I don't know if you guys have even read, you know, these now ancient books, but this is where Thomas Coven, the Unbeliever, comes from. Even the Fiona of Our Tapestry, which was a portal fantasy written by Guy Gavriel Kay. He was Christopher Tolkien's roommate in college, by the way. They worked on the Silmarillion together. He's still writing, by the way. You guys should read Guy Gavriel Kay. He's brilliant. Yes, some people are clapping for him. If you haven't read Taigana or The Lions of Al Rassan, I recommend both of those quite a bit. But fantasy during the 80s was very dominated by this. Like, where sort of genre came from is the publishers are like, can anyone do something like this Tolkien stuff? David Eddings, who was very big at those days, one of my favorite authors, yes. David Eddings says if you ask him where the Bulgaria came from, the publisher Del Rey, it was Lester Del Rey, came and said, we need something like Tolkien. He died, he's not giving us any more. And David Eddings is like, well, I guess I can try something like that. He'd been writing thrillers. He read The Lord of the Rings. He said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And that's where a lot of that early fantasy came from, very deeply inspired by Tolkien. In fact, Eye of the World, one of my favorite books, by Wheel of Time, right? Eye of the World is kind of at the tail end of that. You can really feel the Tolkien influences, particularly on the first couple of Wheel of Time books. Very, very Tolkien influenced. Well, during the 90s, a lot of different things happened. One of them was George R.R. Martin. Yep. Oh yes, George. Hopefully you guys can have George someday come. He's a fantastic speaker and a brilliant writer. And George, if you ask him about the origins of Song of Ice and Fire, he's like, well, it seems like, you know, the good guys always get away with everything. They, you know, it's all about these mighty heroes, or these, you know, if you look at all three of these traditions, most of the time, even the gritty mighty hero ones, the mighty hero's winning, right? And George is like, let's mash this up with the War of the Roses, and we're going to tell a version where the good guys don't necessarily win, or you're not even sure who the good guys are, or there are consequences. And before Game of Thrones took the world by storm, A Song of Ice and Fire took the fantasy community by storm. And what was happening was everybody wanted grim and gritty fantasy. When I would go to the conventions and I would say, I actually pitched once to an editor, I won't mention their name, I said, I have a fantastic book. I would love you to read it. You know, it's called Elantris, and he's like, how dark is it? And I'm like, well, it's kind of dark, you know, it's got a fallen city. It's kind of a zombie story, but not really. And he's like, how like Game of Thrones is it, is what I meant. And I'm like, not really. He's like, come back when you've written something like Game of Thrones. And I kept submitting my books. By then I had written a couple of books I really thought were strong. Elantris, Dragonsteel, White Sand were kind of my three that I was using. And then Aether of Night was also pretty good in there, which were the books. These were books number 6, 7, 8, and 10. We don't talk about 9. Yeah, 9 was terrible. They're all kind of like, only Elantris is actually good of those, but White Sand could be cleaned up and sent out to prom and not look too bad. But I was submitting these books that I felt were pretty strong, and I kept getting rejections. And what they were saying was, you are writing epic fantasy that's, they didn't want to say it outright, but like, there's too much hope in these books. There's too much magic in these books. We want low magic, we want shades of gray, and we want them to be shorter, please. They were really hunting for Joe Abercrombie, right? This is what they really wanted, was Joe Abercrombie. And I don't have a problem with there being lots of different types of fantasy. In fact, I'll get into that a little later, how I think it's important that the genre have a lot of different types. But man, I was hitting a wall. And so for book number 11, I said, all right, I'm gonna try and write a grim and gritty, short, epic fantasy, and it was terrible. It was called Mistborn. It's not the one you've read. It used the magic system, and the magic system was the one thing that worked. The rest of the book was awful. It was this terrible book of me trying to do a bad George R. R. Martin impersonation. And Brandon does not do a good George R. R. Martin impersonation, right? I'm more in the Robert Jordan tradition. I do like some shades of gray, but generally I like to write about stories where there are beacons of light in the darkness and where human nature, I think, is genuinely good. I think most people are good and most people want to be good. And they just sometimes have trouble finding their way to it. And this is like, you know, what drives me. This is what makes me excited. And writing something where everyone was various shades of loathsome just did not work at all. I tried it again in a book called The Final Empire. Not the one you've read. Which was a story about if the hero prophesied to save the world had failed and the terrible world that would result from that. And it did not work either. These were books 11 and 12 of my unpublished career. I was sending out to agents at the time, and my agent, the guy who became my agent eventually, Joshua wrote back to me and said, wow, this last one's way worse than your previous book. He actually said that. He's a New Yorker. They're like that, right? You know how, yeah, any of you who live in New York, you're like, oh yeah, New Yorkers, they'll tell it to you. Actually, I really like New Yorkers because of that. If you go to Hollywood, boy, you get different answers from Hollywood. If they don't like something, they tell you they love it. They really do. And in New York, they let you have it, even if they like it. But he's like, I feel like you've taken a big step backward. What went wrong? And I'm like, So, book number 12, 2 big flops. I felt like I'd written great books nobody wanted. I was getting stacks of rejections. And I thought, my dad's calling me and telling me my mother's concerned. I've written 13 or 12 novels at this point, right? I've written 12 novels, and nobody wants to buy them. what am I doing with my life, right? There might be some writers who've had this experience. I hope not too many of you, but oh man. And that's where my belly of the whale moment was, where I'm like, no one wants to read what I want to write, and I can't write what they want to read. So why am I doing this? And I thought long and hard about this. I spent a long time. I actually had just applied to master's programs in creative writing, and they all rejected me. I applied to the 12 top programs in the US because Slytherin, and every one of them sent me a rejection. And so I'm like, no one wants me in their programs, for university programs. Nobody wants to read what I'm writing. Why? And my eventual conclusion was, you know, I am writing because I want to find out how to do this, right? I went back to that feeling I had as a kid, that feeling that changed my life, and I said, I want to do that. And I decided, you know, if I die at age, let's be optimistic, 107, and I've written 90 unpublished novels, but I've enjoyed every moment of it, then I'm a bigger success than if I stop now at book 12, right? Like, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because of those moments where I sit down to write and I lose 5 hours. And I come out and I'm just really proud of what's happened. I'm doing this because of those moments where I feel like I hit those transcendent moments where everything comes together and, you know, your soul sings and you know someone out there is going to read it and their soul's going to sing. And it's kind of like telepathy, where what I've thought of in my head has gone into your head, but it's changed and become your version of it, and we're like resonating together. Like that's very mumbo-jumbo-y for a science fiction writer, but there's something about it, right? Something about it that's really powerful. So I decided, you know what? I'm probably never going to publish any novels. So I'm just going to write the book that I want to write. They tell me my books are too long. I'm going to write one that's twice as long. They tell me there's too much magic in my books. Well, guess what? We're gonna invent a world with 30 magic systems. And I sat down and I wrote The Way of Kings. Yeah. It wasn't the version that you eventually read. It was a very hard book to write. Most of it, the soul is the same, but it took me a number of years to get that book right. It was beyond my skill at the time, but I loved writing this book. And it was, in many ways, me flipping the bird at the publishing industry, saying, all the stuff you don't want, I'm going to put in here. I'm going to do it all, and you're never going to like it. And I finished that book, and I got a phone call like a few weeks later from Moshe, who's my editor at Tor. I had sent him a book 18 months earlier. Moshe had had it sitting on his desk forever. It was really big, and he's like, oh man, this is a really big book. I don't know. He eventually, though, what he told me is, you were such a nice guy when I met you at the convention. I just couldn't reject it without at least reading it. He eventually read it. And he read it and spent all night reading it. It was Elantris. And he fell in love with it. And he contacted me the next day. Took a little bit longer than that, various reasons. He eventually got a hold of me and offered to buy Elantris. The year after, I had given up on ever publishing again. I had stopped sending books out. This is one that had sent out 18 months before. And so, like, I have the fairy tale, right? I don't know that I can, in fact, I'm sure I can't promise you the fairy tale. The fairy tale of doing all the stuff I'm not supposed to do and having it work out. But I did do some things I was supposed to do, which is make sure I was writing what I loved, and I dallied in what I didn't love, and it didn't work. And so if I can give you any advice, if there are writers out here, it is, you know, trust and follow write what you want to read, but which no one has written yet. And I can't guarantee that the whims of entertainment will ever actually want that. But you want it, so there's at least one person, and that's going to guide you better. Like people, one of the things they said is, oh, talk about where fantasy's going, right? Where's the genre going? I'm like, okay, in 2002, I sat at a convention like this in the audience listening to a group of experts talk about where the genre was going. And what did they say? They said, don't write any vampire books. This was editors, professional editors. Every one of them said, no more vampire books. Vampires are dead, pun intended. No one wants to read or buy vampire books. Guess what came out around that time? Twilight, right? A group of professional editors were not willing to read vampire books because they were oversaturated and no one wanted them anymore. I don't think that anyone out there knows where the genre is absolutely going. Like, I can tell you where it is, and where it is in a pretty good place. We've had a couple of big things happen in the genre that are really helpful for us. The first one is the explosion of what was traditionally nerd culture becoming mainstream culture. This is primarily comic book movies, but also strong adaptations of Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones have made people say, oh wow, I really like this. I understand this whole idea of extremes of human experience told through the lens of a different world can reflect my world in a really exciting way, plus be fun. Like, everyone's getting that now. And because of that, there's really never been a better time to write fantasy because of that. And then the other big kind of revolution is, I feel like we finally got out a bit from underneath Tolkien's shadow. Not that I think Tolkien is a bad thing. In fact, I love Tolkien. But because we spent so long, I often say like humans, like the Apollo program in the US getting to the moon, like pushed their ability beyond what was technologically really reasonable. And we've only now started catching up to where we probably would have gone if there hadn't been the external pressure of, you know, the Cold War and things like that. And I think Tolkien was just really ahead of his time. And because he was so far ahead of his time doing something so interesting and different, it took us a while to catch up. That's not to say that the writers who wrote in his shadow as much are any worse writers. I think they're fantastic writers. They explored what we needed explored. But I do think that the genre kind of stepping out from that has made it more open and broad as a genre. Fantasy should be the genre where you can do anything, right? That is what makes us great. You can come into fantasy, and as soon as you do something weird, you're one of us, right? You can be writing the most normal, you know, literary fiction, but you put in a science fiction element, and Margaret Atwood, you're ours now. Yep. You belong to us. Welcome to the family. This should be the genre that allows people to do whatever they want. But for a lot of times, whatever you want had to kind of include a quest and elves and dwarfs and a hero's journey, right? Just because that was people catching up to where it was. And nowadays, I feel like the genre has expanded a lot more. I feel like people have realized there were other places to base ideas on than generic medieval England. There are other types of stories that can be told than a hero's journey, and people were always trying to tell these. There were some great writers who did great stuff, but the kind of mass appeal of these things was just not there, and now I think it is getting there. The fact that N.K. Jemisin sells as much as she does is an indication that the genre is really interested in going some different places. And so because of that, I feel like it's opened wide up. I feel like people who want to write very Tolkien-esque stuff, there's still some great Tolkien-esque things being written. There's still an audience for it. The genre has just gotten bigger. Ebooks has helped with this a lot. Being able to self-publish, being able to have smaller print runs and things like this. The genre has never been in a better place. Where is it going, though? I can't really tell you. I can tell you this. In a lot of ways, the generation after Tolkien reacted to Tolkien, right? And then the generation after that reacted against Tolkien. This is the grim and gritty. And then my generation, me and Pat Rothfuss and Brent Weeks and all of these people are kind of reacting against that generation, right? And what we're doing is we're creating these like rule-based magic systems instead of the kind of very low magic, the things like Game of Thrones and whatnot and things. So whatever you guys are doing is probably going to be a reaction against me in a good way, right? You'll probably be like, I've read Sanderson, I'm gonna take it where the places he wouldn't go, and stuff like that. So whatever it's gonna be, you're going to create it, and that's exciting. That's wonderful. You're on the edge like I am now. For years, I'm like, oh, I'm the new rookie. I'm the new kid. I can't say that anymore. I'm approaching 15 years since Launchers was published, which just kind of dumbfounds me, because if you look at where Robert Jordan was 15 years after he published Eye of the World, that was 2005. And so I'm approaching like a long tenure as one of the grand old masters of this, which is terrifying because I'm not that old. But you're going to take it new places. And so really, you should be the ones talking about where it's going to be, not me. So I hope the convention gives you lots of times and opportunity to talk about your love of fantasy, where you think it should go. Even if you're not a writer, you as readers will determine where it goes. And so thank you guys very much for having me. I hope you have a wonderful festival. All right, so we have about 40 minutes still. Give me a microphone and an hour will pass with me blabbing. This is what happens. I did end up becoming a professor, only of science fiction and fantasy, but I sure do know how to talk. That's never been a problem. So why don't we go ahead and do kind of a short Q&A. If you can theme this one more toward fantasy, because I have other Q&As that are going to be more about my work, but really whatever you want to know, and I'll repeat the question after you ask it, and so that people can hear it. So we'll go right here.
All right. So my question is about this. If someone wants to be a writer, then for myself it's very problematic because of, the financial side. What are you going to eat? So
yeah.
How would you debate them or just
So the question is, if someone wants to be a writer, it's problematic because it's a hard job to do, and what are you going to eat? Where is the balance between being realistic about these things and still hunting your dream? And in this case, this is the tough question, right? Like, writing is this weird thing where there's no guarantee, and it's going to take you 10 years, most likely, to figure out how to do it. You may spend 10 years and never make a cent or a shekel off of your writing, right? Like, there's really no guarantee. And it's tough. It really is. I took a route that I can't really suggest to everyone, because what I did is I got a job working a hotel graveyard shift, and I wrote at work. Because it was a job where I had lots of downtime, but it also paid minimum wage, which is not something you can raise a family on, right? And so I got fortunate that about the time where I needed to be looking at making a real job happen, I ended up selling. So I lived the fairy tale. You're better off asking people who didn't live the fairy tale, who worked and kept a full-time job and a family while writing. I can tell you this. There are some jobs that drain you emotionally to a point that it makes it hard to write. This doesn't mean they're bad jobs. Teaching tends to be one of these, right? A lot of teachers I know give a lot of themselves to their students. And at the end of the day, they're so exhausted from giving so much to their students, from grading papers, from things like this, that it's really hard to find time to write. Whereas other people who do jobs that are a little more hands-on, like working with your hands, like being a mechanic actually tends to be a really good job for people who want to be writers, because something that you work with your hands, that you can get in the zone, but you can also in the back of your mind be thinking about what you're going to write that night when you get home. And sitting down in the chair, you're kind of invigorated because your body's tired, but your mind's awake. Those sorts of jobs tend to work really well for writers, but not everyone can do that. Computer programmer tends to be a terrible job for a writer. Statistically, and this is because writing compute programming uses the same part of your brain as writing a story. Generally, programming is the closest thing you can find to storytelling that is not storytelling. Some people can do it and then come home and do it more, but if you do your job all day and then come home and don't want to program anymore, you're going to often have time, that same sort of sitting down to write. A lot of people find that they're exhausted from doing that, basically exercising the same muscles all day. But at the same time, if you have a talent for writing, you probably have a talent for computer programming because they are such similar disciplines. And so at the end of the day, you're going to have to find your own way here. I do think you have to be realistic because having what happened to me is a little like hitting the lottery, because there are plenty of fantastic writers who I know personally. I know writers as good as I am who have never sold a book. There's one in my writing group, Kaylin. Genius, wonderful writer. She's written something like 25 novels now and never sold one. There's no guarantee, and that is heart-wrenching. What I can tell you is there's a better chance than you think. So I took a class at the university where I met a bunch of people who are in my writing group right now. And that class was 20 people. And of those 20 people in that class, about 5 of us went pro. Now, that's better odds than people would tell you, right? If you say, what are my chances of becoming a writer? Yeah, they're like 1 in 1,000 or whatever. But if you actually get people who are actively writing together and ask what their chances are, the chances are not terrible. A lot of times people I know who are willing to dedicate their 10 years of their life to writing books and keep going at it, it's like 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 eventually go pro. But if you went to school to become a doctor and spent 10 years learning the medical field, and they told you 1 out of 5 is actually going to be able to get a job, you would run from that, you know. You would not spend 10 years going through med school to not get a job. And that's basically what you have to do with writing, is you have to be willing to put in all of that effort on the 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 chance that you'll actually be able to go pro. And not all pros can do a full-time living at it as well. So write because you want to write. Set up your life in such a way that you would be happy continuing on going if you never sell. Doing a job you enjoy, writing as much as, you know, enjoying. Maybe you would be like, I would love it so much more if I could write all the time. But find a good balance that lets you produce stories. I would say you want to be looking at writing a book every 2 years would be where I would want to get. One a year if you can go faster, and be okay with that life. Even if you never hit the lottery, you'll be way happier than if you go all in and don't make it, or if you just never do it at all because it's too scary that it might not work out. Find that balance. That's the best I can give you. There probably are people in this audience who can give you better advice on this than I can, because I live in fairy tale land. I live in magical Christmas land, where I not only sold a book, within a few years I was one of the best-selling authors in my genre, which is just insane. All right, questions right here. Yes. Mm-hmm. Hi. Oh, they're clapping for you. Mm-hmm. Oh, excellent question. So the question's a two-parter. One is, how have I found adapting and using religion in my stories? What's been my process and how have I felt that? And number two, being LDS, how has being Mormon changed through how I have written, right? So part number one, I find that what I am fascinated by generally make better storytelling, right? And I am fascinated by people's interaction with the divine, or people's reaction to religion, or people's disinclination toward either, right? One thing I told myself early on, and I would recommend this to you, one thing I hate in books is when I find the character who's like me, who's the one person in the book who shares my viewpoint, and then they exist to be proven wrong. That drives me up the wall, right? I don't mind it so much if there's a variety of people who have different viewpoints and several are like mine and one of them has a change of mind, that's okay. That's good storytelling. But when there's only one token person who's espousing the viewpoint that I have, and they give a straw man argument that's terrible, and then they learn how stupid they are and change, drives me up the wall. And I told myself, I'm never going to do that, right? If I'm going to take a book and I'm going to write someone who has someone's belief system or lack of beliefs, or a view on the world, I'm going to treat that with respect. And that character can evolve. Characters should evolve. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to make straw man arguments. I'm not going to make bad arguments in that character's mouth to espouse something just because it isn't what I necessarily believe. And I would recommend that to you. What you are wanting to do, and you want to write books that express truth, you don't arrive at truth through weak contrasting arguments. You arrive at truth through strong contrasting arguments. And the stronger you can make the arguments on every side, the better off you're going to be. Now, I, as an author, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis had a disagreement. Tolkien believed that stories should not be metaphors, that they should be stories unto themselves, and he said, I abhor metaphor. C.S. Lewis believed that stories were metaphor, and the main reason that you wrote them was to be didactic, to teach something. I fall more on the Tolkien side. I'm never really going into a book wanting to teach anything. I want to explore. I want to search. I want to find answers. I had Hoyd paraphrase this in one of the books where he says, the purpose of the storyteller is not to give you answers, but to give you questions. I stole that from a sentiment that I heard Robert Jordan speak in an interview. It wasn't exactly that idea, but that's where I got it, that he loves when his books raise questions. And so what you read in my books is me trying to explore theology, explore religion, and explore how people react and think about it. And trying to really get inside the heads of people who are different from myself. And this is why in the Stormlight Archive, right, you have Kaladin, who's agnostic, you have Yasna, who's atheist, you have Navani, who's a conservative, and you have Dalinar, who's a religious reformer, right? And my religion is in the Dalinar camp, right? Religious reformer, that's the Mormon religion. But we have an orthodoxy, we have agnostic, we have atheist, and the goal is not necessarily to prove one right, it's to say, kind of we're all in this together, right? Like that's how life is, we're all in this together. And we're not gonna agree, but we don't have to be as mean to each other as we sometimes are. And if I have a theme for my work, it's that I just want to see how people like Yasna think. So I go to a lot of forums, I read about what atheists are saying, and I try to express, like, I want to be her when I'm writing her and think like she does. And that's just one of my goals. And has that changed my view of religion? Absolutely, right? Working through all these different eyes, and really what you're seeing is me trying to explore the world through different puppets, that I'm trying to be that person. I'm being Wayne. I'm putting on a hat. I'm becoming a different person for a little while, and I'm trying to really be that person for a time, and that leaves a change on you. And it has made me kind of evolve how I think about things, and mostly it's made me listen better, I hope, if that makes sense. And I think learning to listen better is something that particularly a Slytherin needs to learn. And so it's still a journey, but that's kind of a rambling answer to your question. Yeah. All right, we're gonna do one more. Okay, you're waving the thing. I will have a big Q&A session later. So we'll have one that's just all Q&A. So go ahead.
You said that you really like the theme in Lord of the Rings.
Yep. Yep.
What is your opinion on movies based on books? Because I see them every time and they ruin it for me. Like the
Okay.
Harry Potter movie, ruin it. Like, although I can see Still Hearts become a movie, I really
Right.
want that because when I read it, I see it as a movie. But I'm very afraid when it will become a movie, the movie will not be my expectation.
What an excellent question. This is a really good question. So he asked me, what is my opinion on books to film? Because for him personally, when he sees a film, it always ruins the book. Meaning they're doing the book in the way you wouldn't want to see it done. And that's totally a valid opinion, right? Like the beautiful thing about writing, one of the things I love about it so much is I don't hand you a finished story. I hand you a script for you to finish in your head, right? I am the screenwriter, you're the director. And so your version of Kaladin doesn't look like my version or anyone else's version because it's your version and you get to be the director. And when I read, this is what I love about books. People ask me where Hoyd came from in the connected universe. The secret, the true secret, is I was reading Anne McCaffrey books. And I thought, oh, what if I had a character in these books? What would I do? And I started imagining certain characters being my characters who had the behind-the-scenes story that the characters in the book didn't know about. And they were from other worlds, and they were jumping between the books I was reading. And Hoyd was in the Dragon Riders of Pern, and he was in the Sunrunners books, and he was in the Belgariad. And then a character would come on screen and say something, I'd be like, that's secretly Hoyd. He's here doing this thing. He's come from Pern for this reason. That was how I enjoyed reading books. I have a friend who, when he read Wheel of Time, he ignored every description of character because he wanted to imagine the way he wanted. He's like, no, Tom Maryland doesn't have a mustache. And I'm like, a mustache is a pretty big deal to Tom. He's always going like this. He's like, no, in my version, Tom Maryland does not have a mustache. And this is what books... What's that? Yeah, I know, blasphemy, right? But this is what books let you do. You have line item veto on my books. When you read a book and I say something happened and you don't want it to happen, you are right. You rewrite it and it's your version. When you imagine a character a certain way, that's your version of the character. And a book doesn't really live until that's happened to it, in my opinion, right? You finish the art that I begin. Movies are not the same way. Movies are great. They do different things, right? The stuff you can do with tricks of camera and light and framing and perspective are so cool in movies. It really makes me envious of how they can use things like a flickering light in a room to enhance a sense of surrealism in ways that if I do it, you're like, he's drawing too much attention to that light, right? Like, movies can get away with all kinds of visual metaphors that books can't do. But what they don't have is they don't have you completing it. You get the completed vision presented to you. And because of that, books to film, a lot of people are going to have the same problem you do. I generally do not. And this is because as kind of a student of multiple disciplines, and I love film language and things like this, I really enjoy seeing how they interpret the book. It's not my version of the book, but it's their version. It lets me see inside the director's head and see a different take on it. It's why I like seeing fan art and why I like seeing different covers of my books, because each of those are the same thing. They're just one person's vision and interpretation, and it's being completed by one person. And that's not the canon answer, because there isn't one, right? The cover is not the canon interpretation of the characters. It's Michael Whalen or someone else's interpretation of it. And it's generally close. We try to get it close, but it doesn't have to be. And so for me, I love seeing books to film because it doesn't ruin the book for me because the book is still there and my version of it still exists. I'm just getting to see someone else's version. And so I'm very aggressive at trying to get my books made into films, hopefully good ones. Steel Heart's owned by Sean Levy. He's one of the directors of Stranger Things. He also made a really great film that a lot of people watched, which was Real Steel, which is an adaptation of Richard Matheson's story. That was a really great book, great film. And so Sean Levy has that. I'm very hopeful. I really like Sean Levy. But I can't guarantee that any of this will happen because putting up $250 million to make a movie is a lot of money. I can't write a check like that. So we'll see what happens. All right. So because people will ask, I'll also answer the question of where are all the other rights. Mostly at this point, I'm keeping a lot of these rights kind of close to my heart and not selling them off as easily as I did earlier in my career. I just don't need the money anymore. And so I'm being a little more discerning, being a little slower to sign deals. So we have The Reckoners at Fox with Sean Levy. I did sell Legion for a television show. That's under option right now. But we likely will sell Alcatraz here very soon. Yes, for an animated show. That's our goal for that. Yeah. A lot of people ask if I will make animated Mistborn or Stormlight. That's on the table. It's really going to depend on where some of these animation projects, like the Castlevania adaptation and things like that, if this continues to be a good and viable method of storytelling. So it's certainly not off the table, but neither are live action television shows. Like, I really want to see how The Witcher does. I want to see how Wheel of Time does. I'm a producer on that. I'm actually flying to Prague after this. How the new Lord of the Rings at Amazon does, right? I want to see how they're doing with fantasy in this sort of post Game of Thrones world. So we'll see. Hopefully we'll get a really good Rothfuss adaptation out of Showtime. Like, there's a lot of cool things happening, so yeah, so we will see. Right now, most of the Cosmere is not under contract to anyone anymore, and I'm just kind of holding on to it. There's a company, DMG, that I've been working with on some of them, and they still are involved. I still like them, but we're moving slowly right now. We're just kind of keeping our eyes open. So, all right, what am I going to read to you guys? Well, we're going to read Rhythm of War. Yes. So Rhythm of War is the working title and most likely the final title of Stormlight 4. There are not that many things I can actually read to you that won't spoil the first book. There are a few. For those who haven't read the Stormlight books, all of the prologues take place on the same day. And each book, so the books move forward, we always flash back to a different prologue from a different character's viewpoint on the same day that the king was assassinated. And that's not a spoiler because the first line of the book, of the prologue, is character thinking about how they're there to assassinate the king. So the thing I'm going to warn you about here is that my continuity editor has not been through this yet, and these prologues get really tricky to intertwine because of where everybody is at certain times. And so whenever I turn in one of these prologues, it's a lot of work to make sure that each of the characters can be where they need to be so that the prologues don't go out of continuity with each other. So do be warned, this is first draft, right? But this is Navani's prologue to Rhythm of War. Of course the Parshendi wanted to play their drums. Of course Gavilar had told them they could. And of course he hadn't thought to warn Navani. "Have you seen the size of those instruments?" Aratham said, running her hands through her black hair. "Where will we put them? We can't..." "We moved to the upper feast hall," Navani said, trying to project a calm demeanor. Everybody else in the kitchens was close to panicky. Cooks running one direction or another, pots banging. Gavilar had invited not just the High Princes, but their relatives, and every High Lord in the town. And he wanted a baker's feast. And now, drums? "We've already set up in the lower hall," Aratham cried. "I don't have the staff to." "There are twice as many soldiers as usual loitering around the palace tonight," Navani said. "We'll have them move the tables." Gavilar never forgot about things like posting extra guards, projecting strength, making a show of force. He'd always be counted on to do that. For everything else, he had Navani. "Could work, yes," Aratham said. "Good to put the louds to work rather than having them underfoot. All right, deep breaths." The short palace organizer scuttled away, narrowly avoiding an apprentice cook carrying a large bowl of steaming shellfish. Navani stepped to the side and let the cook pass. The man nodded in thanks. The staff had long since stopped being nervous when she entered the kitchens. She'd made it clear to them that doing their jobs efficiently was superior praise to her than a bow. Fortunately, the staff was the kind of middle-ranked Luddites who understood the need for a little practicality. They seemed to have things well in hand now, though there had been a scare earlier when 3 barrels of grain had been discovered with worms in them. A little creative thinking had reminded them that Lord Amaram had stores for his men, and Navani had been able to pry them out of his grip. For now, it seemed that with the extra cooks borrowed from the monastery, they might actually be able to feed all the extra people that Gavilar had invited. "I should leave some of the tables set up in the lower hall," she thought, slipping out of the kitchens and into the palace gardens. "Who knows who might show up with an invitation? At the very least, she might need to feed some of the military officers who couldn't be seated in the main feast hall. She turned to hike up through the gardens and enter the palace through the side doors. She'd be less out of the way and wouldn't have to dodge servants if she went out here into the gardens. Maybe she could. Navani slowed. The Kolinar Palace was brightly lit tonight, with spheres adorning every hallway and all of the garden walkways. By that light, Navani could easily make out Aesudan, her daughter-in-law, Elkar's wife, standing at the fountains. The slender woman wore her long hair in a bun, which was lit with a gemstone of each shade. All those colors were gaudy together. Navani preferred a few simple stones, themed to a color, but it did make Aesudan stand out as she chatted with two elderly ardents. Storms bright and brash. Was that Rusher Chris, the artist and master artifabrian? When had he gotten into town? Who had invited him? He was holding a small box with a flower painted on it. Could that be one of his new fabrials? Navani found herself drawn toward the group, all other thoughts fleeing her mind. How had he gotten the heating fabrial to work? What had captured the flame spread? How did he make the temperature vary? She'd seen drawings, but to talk to the master artifabrian himself... Aesudan saw Navani and then smiled brightly. The joy seemed genuine, which was unusual, at least when directed at Navani. She tried not to take Aesudan's general sourness around her as a personal affront. It was the prerogative of every woman to feel threatened by her mother-in-law, particularly when the girl was so obviously lacking in talents. Fortunately, Elkar liked her, and she was of a good family. Navani smiled at her in turn, trying to enter the conversation and get a better look at that fabrial. Aesudan, however, took Navani by the arm. Mother, I had forgotten completely about our appointment. I'm so fickle sometimes. Terribly sorry, ardent Chris, but I must make a hasty exit. Aesudan tugged Navani forcefully back through the gardens toward the kitchens. Thank Collect you showed up, Mother. That man is the most dreadful bore. Bore, Navani said, twisting to look over his shoulder. He was talking about gemstones and other gemstones and spren and boxes of spren and storms. What a night. You would think you would understand. I have important people to meet. The wives of high princes, the best generals in the land come to gawk at the wild parshmen. Then I get stuck in the gardens talking to ardents. Your son ditched me there, I'll have you know, when I find that boy. Navani extricated herself from Aesudan's grip. Someone should go entertain those ardents. Why are they here? Don't ask me, Aesudan said. Gavilar wanted them for something, but he made Elkar entertain them. Poor manners, that is, really. Gavilar had invited one of the world's most prominent artifabrians to visit the palace, and he hadn't even bothered to tell Navani? An anger stirred deep inside her, a fury she kept carefully penned and locked away most of the time. That man, that storming man, how could he? Calm, Navani, the rational side of her mind said. Maybe he intends to introduce you to the ardent as a gift. He knows how interested you are in fabrials. Perhaps that was it. Brightness, a voice called from the kitchens. Brightness, Navani, oh please, we have a problem. Aesudan, Navani said, eyes on the ardent, who was slowly walking away toward the path to the monastery. She could catch him. She could spare a few minutes. Could you help the kitchens with whatever they need? I'd like to... But Aesudan was already hurrying off toward another group in the gardens, one attended by several powerful High Lord generals. Navani took a deep breath, shoving down another stab of annoyance. Aesudan claimed to care about propriety and manners, but she'd butt into any conversation between men without even her husband with her as an excuse. Brightness, the cook called, waving to her. Navani took one last look at the ardents, then set her jaw and hurried back to the kitchen, careful not to catch her skirt on the ornamental shale bark. What now? Wine, the cook said. We're out of both the Clavina and the Ruby Bench. How? Navani said. We ordered... She shared a look with the cook, and the answer was evident. Dalinar had been at the wine again, it appeared. I have a private store, Navani said, pulling her notebook from her pocket. She gripped it in her safe hand through the sleeve, scribbling a note. I keep it in the monastery, with Sister Nana. Show her this, and she'll give you access. Thank you, Brightness, the cook said, taking the note. Before the cook was even out the door, however, Navani spotted the house steward, a white-bearded man with too many rings on his fingers, standing in the stairwell up to the palace proper. He was fidgeting with his rings on his left hand. Bother. What is it? She asked, striding over. Guests have started to arrive, Brightness, including Harlord Vama, who has promised an audience with the king regarding the border disputes. You know, the one about the misdrawn maps. Yes, Navani said, sighing. And my husband? Vanished, Brightness, the steward said. He was seen with Bright Lord Amaram and some of those uncommon figures. That was the term the palace staff used for Gavilar's new friends, the ones who seemed to arrive without warning or announcement, and who rarely gave their names. Navani ground her teeth, thinking through the places Gavilar might have gotten himself to. There were a few rooms he tended to use. He would probably be angry if she interrupted him. Well, good. He should be seeing to his duties rather than just assuming she'd handle it all. Unfortunately, at the moment, well, she would have to handle it all. Bright Lord Vama couldn't be left waiting. She let the anxious steward lead her up to the grand entryway, where guests were being entertained with music, drink, and poetry while the feast was being prepared. Others were going with master servants to view the Parshendi, the night's true novelty. It wasn't every day the king of Alfcar signed a treaty with a group of mysterious parshmen who could talk. She dealt with Vama, offering apologetic words, even going so far as to review the maps herself, and as far as to promise to review the maps herself and write him a judgment. From there, she was stopped from locating Gavilar by a line of needy men and women who had come specifically to get the king's attention. A privilege that was growing more and more difficult these days, unless you were one of the uncommon figures. Navani assured Bright Lords their petitions were being heard. She promised to look into injustices. She soothed the crumpled feelings of those who thought a personal invitation from the king would mean they'd actually get to see that king. It was emotionally taxing work, but nothing new to her, and fully within the queen's expected duties. Navani didn't resent her station. Perhaps someday she'd be able to spend her days tinkering with fabrials and pretending that she was a scholar. For now, she had duties. The only thing that truly bothered her was the fact that she shouldn't have to do those duties alone. She was unsurprised at asking that more guests were still indeed showing up, ones that weren't even on the list and annoyed Gavilar had provided for her earlier in the day. Vev's golden keys. Navani kept her increasing fury under control, painting an amicable face on for the arriving guests. She smiled, she laughed, she waved. Using the cheat sheet she kept in her notebook, she asked after families, new births, and favorite axe hounds. She inquired about trade situations, took notes on which light eyes seemed to be avoiding others. In short, she acted regal. She always felt like an imposter, and with good reason. She hadn't been born to this station. Gavilar, Navani, Sadius, Ela, they'd taken these mantles upon themselves. And however prestigious their ancient lineage, Navani had to work hard to suppress the anxiety that whispered she was really just a backwater country girl wearing someone else's clothing. Those insecurities have been stronger lately. Calm, calm, no room for that sort of thinking. She rounded the room and was happy to note that Aesadon had found Elokar and was chatting with him for once, rather than other men. Elokar did look happy presiding over the pre-feast gathering in his father's absence. Adel and Renarin were there in stiff uniforms, the former delighting a small group of young women, the latter looking gangly and awkward as he stood by his brother. And there was Dalinar, standing tall, somehow taller than any man in the room, but with those haunted eyes, simmering with passion. He wasn't drunk yet, and people orbited him, like they might have fire in a cold night, needing to be close, but not daring step up and risk the true heat of his presence. Storms. She complained to her current conversation partners that she was feeling a little faint, and after assuring them that she would be fine, made a brief exit up the steps to where she wouldn't feel so warm. It was probably a bad idea to leave. They were lacking a king, so if the queen vanished too, questions were bound to arise. But surely everyone could get on without her for a short time. Besides, up here, she could check one of Gavilar's hiding places. He would probably come this direction, away from both the guests and the location of the new feast hall. Parshendi with their drums passed nearby, speaking a language she did not understand, though one of the young interpreters was with them, so Navani could have asked if she'd wanted. Instead, she twisted her way through the dungeon-like hallways. Why couldn't this place have been a little more light? It had a few more windows. She brought the matter up with Gavilar, but he liked it this way. It gave him more places to hide. There, she thought, stopping at an intersection. Voices. Being able to bring them back and forth from Braze doesn't mean anything, Gavilar, one of them said. It's too close to be a relevant distance. It was impossible just a few short years ago, said a deep, powerful voice, his. This is proof. The connection is not severed, but can be warped to allow for travel. Not yet as far as you'd like, but we must start the journey somewhere. Navani inched forward, looking around the corner. Yes, there he was, right where she'd expected him to be, in her study. A place she rarely had time to visit, but also a place where people were unlikely to search for the king. It was a cozy little room with a nice window, tucked away in the corner of the second floor. He'd left the door cracked, and she inched up to peer in. Gavilar Colin had a big enough presence to fill a room all by himself. He wore a beard, but instead of being unfashionable on him, it looked classic. Like he was a painting come to life, a representation of old Albathar. By wearing the beard, some had thought he might start a new fashion trend, but nobody else had been able to pull off the look. Others simply didn't have Gavilar's strong features. Beyond that, there was an air of distortion around Gavilar. Nothing supernatural or nonsensical. It was just that, well, you accepted that Gavilar could do whatever he wanted, in defiance of any tradition or logic. For him, it would work out. That was just the way of things. The king was speaking with two men that Navani vaguely recognized. Ambassadors from the West, where they'd been called, or ambassadors from the West were what they'd been called, but no kingdom had been given for their home. They were simply among Gavilar's uncommon visitors. A tall Azish man with a birthmark on his cheek, and a shorter Alethi man with a round face and a small nose. The Azish one leaned back against the bookcase, arm folded, face completely emotionless. The Alethi man wrung his hands, reminding Navani of the palace steward, though this man was much younger. Somewhere in his 20s? Maybe his 30s? No, he could be older. On the table between Gavilar and the men were a group of spheres. Navani's breath caught as she saw them. They were arrayed in a variety of colors and brightnesses. Several seemed strangely off. They glowed with a color that seemed somehow an inverse of light, as if they were pits of violet darkness, sucking in the color around them. She'd never seen anything like it before. The gemstones with spren trapped inside them could have all kinds of odd looks and effects. Those spheres, they must be for Fabrials. And Gavilar was talking to two strangers about them? She was reminded of the Artifabrian in the gardens. What was he doing with spheres, strange light, and Fabrials? And why couldn't Gavilar talk to her about? Gavilar suddenly stood up straight, then glanced toward the doorway. Their eyes met. She couldn't tell how he'd spotted her, as she hadn't made any sound. As soon as she was seen, she pushed open the door, acting like she had been on her way in anyway. She wasn't spying. She was queen of this palace. She could go anywhere she wished, particularly her own study. Husband, she said, there are guests missing you at the gathering. You seem to have lost track of time. Gentlemen, Gavilar said to the two ambassadors, I will need to excuse you for the moment. The nervous Leslie man ran his hand through his wispy hair. I want to know more of the project, Gavilar. Plus, you need to know something else. I think another of us is here tonight. I spotted her handiwork earlier. I have a meeting shortly with Meridas and the others, Gavilar said. They should have more information for me. We can speak again after that. No, the Azish man said, voice sharp. I doubt that we shall. There's more here, Nail, the Alethi man said, but his friend towed him out the door, protesting. This is important. I want out. This is the only way. What was that about? Navani asked as Gavilar closed the door. Those are no ambassadors. Who are they really? Gavilar did not answer. With seeming deliberate motions, he walked back to the table and began plucking the spheres one by one and placing them into a pouch. Navani ducked forward and snatched one off the table. What are they? How did you get spheres that glow like this? Does it have anything to do with the Artifabrians you've invited, without telling me, I might add, to come visit you? She looked at him, waiting for some kind of answer, some kind of explanation. Instead, he held out his hand for her spheres. Her sphere. This does not concern you, Navani. Return to the party. She closed her hand around the sphere. So I can continue to cover for you? Did you promise Vama that you'd mediate a dispute tonight, of all times? Do you know how many people are expecting you? Did you say you have another meeting to go to now, before the feast even begins? Are you simply trying to ignore our guests? Do you know, he said softly, how tired I grow of your constant questions, woman? Well, perhaps try answering one or two of them then. It's a novel experience, answering someone, treating them like a human being, rather than a machine built to count the days of the week for you. He wagged his hand, demanding the sphere be returned. Instinctively, she shied back, holding it. Why? Why do you continue to shut me out? Please just tell me. I deal in secrets you could not handle, Navani, if you knew the scope of what I've begun. I'm going to end there. Yeah, I'm sorry. Half, 2/3 of the prologue. Like I said, hasn't gone through continuity yet, and there are sure to find things that contradict things I've written in previous books, so don't hold me too hard to first draft. Really, in first draft, I'm trying to lay down emotional beats and some of the story beats, and then we'll worry about continuity. Either way, I have a lot more things to do while I'm here for the next couple days. Welcome to Eikon. I hope you guys have a wonderful convention.